Thank you, everyone. Thanks for sticking through the day and being here and having me at University of South Australia. I think this is my third talk here. My first was on mindfulness practices, where I led the group in meditation. Last year, I think we did a breathing exercise. This year, you're off the hook, so no meditation or anything in this talk. So like Abelardo mentioned, I am a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Colorado Boulder. I work with Dr. Sydney DeMello in the Emotive Computing Lab. And my main interest is self-regulation. So in the last comment that got me thinking, I'll just make a brief comment, that I do think self-regulation is critically important. It's uniquely human, but I don't think it's the whole story. And I'll talk about ways that we've measured self-regulation and ways we've tried to build it, but I don't think it really gets at the whole individual. I'm really interested in the future and understanding ways in which we can use analytics to try to get it at the whole person. And I'm not sure if analytics will ever get us there. I think human relationships are at the core of success in life and beyond. So that's just a little caveat. So to self-regulation. I started studying this in the lab with children. This is me doing cognitive testing on a child sitting in a tiny chair that I did not fit in. It took me a year to collect data on 200 kiddos. And so since then, times have changed. This research moved more into the real world, into a museum setting, where I was assessing executive functioning skills, self-regulatory abilities from children, and then later adults in this sort of setting, using different technologies to do so. Then I got into work around psychophysiology, making assessments and inferring self-regulation from signals from the body. So taking measurements of heart rate variability, skin activity that gives us an indication of arousal, and so on. So sort of using these physiological signals to infer self-regulatory behavior. And I'll touch on some data later on in the talk about that. More recently, I've been working with Sydney and the Emotive Computing team for a few months now in Boulder. So I'm doing more work in the learning space particularly. So I'm doing work in a game called Physics Playground. Essentially, it's a learning game where the idea is to get a ball to a balloon, and you draw different agents in order to do that. And I'm studying self-regulation in the context of that learning game. So the thing that undercuts all of these different projects and my work thus far is self-regulation. And I do think that the ability to self-regulate is one of the most important skills for learning. It is a stronger predictor of school readiness, so a child's ability to be able to sit in a classroom and take in information. It's a stronger predictor of school readiness than IQ. It predicts academic success throughout the lifespan. It is important for success in the workplace. It's even important for our interpersonal skills. So it predicts richer and more positive interpersonal relationships. And adults with better self-regulation report being happier and having just a better quality of life in general. So it's important for all of these aspects of life. At the core of self-regulation is attention. So self-regulation skills are attention skills. These skills are required for any goal-directed behavior. So they're important for control of our thoughts, control of our actions, and as well as regulation of our emotions. The skills that fall under the topic of self-regulation are broad. So like I said, at the core is attention skills. So focusing attention, maintaining attention to particular objects, the ability to flexibly shift our attention between different ideas and concepts, to hold competing information in mind and be able to work with that information. Reflecting on information and experiences, it's a part of self-regulation. Recognizing and regulating our emotions, and regulating our stress response physiology. So this touches on the fact that a lot of this it's embodied. We feel it in our bodies. And to be able to recognize our thoughts, our actions, our emotions within our bodies is a really important skill. So William James, the father of psychology back in the late 1800s, said, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. An education which should improve this faculty would be an education par excellence." So we know that in education, self-regulation is quite important, and so this has been touched on throughout the day, is this idea of self-regulated learning. So self-regulated learning it's an active form of learning. The learner's metacognitively, motivationally, and behaviorally engaged in the learning process. Some strategies that fall under this include self-monitoring, goal setting, among others. My interest isn't so much self-regulated learning in particular, but building the self-regulation skills so that a person can be a self-regulated learner. So the question for me is, how do we build self-regulation within an individual so that not only does that allow them to engage in self-regulated learning, but how does that transfer beyond the learning process into other areas of life? And this is because self-regulation isn't important just for learning. It's important for mental and physical health and well-being. It's also important for economic, social, and academic success over the life course. This is evident from a study that came out in 2011. This was a study that had a big impact on me. It followed 1,000 children in Dunedin, New Zealand, from essentially, I think, birth to now they're in their 40s. And it took measurements of self-regulation yearly throughout the first decade of life. And in this particular paper, they showed that these skills assessed early on in life, in childhood, were predictive of a wide range of adaptive outcomes, including economic success. So it predicted wealth at age 32. It predicted lower mental health problems. It predicted academic success and lower criminal activity. So I hope that I've convinced you that self-regulation is quite important. I think we all are in agreement on that. And what I want to focus on is how this self-regulation and attention, this is the first thing to really go when we're stressed and when we're experiencing anxious thoughts. So William James also said that the great thing in all of education is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. So how do we do that? How do we work with ourselves? How do we work with our bodies to build these skills within ourselves? So there are 3 ways I'm summarizing here that I think that we could build self-regulatory behavior. One is to train it specifically. So I'll talk about a couple methods that we've used to train our attention skills, to train self-regulation specifically. We could also reduce things that impair our self-regulatory skills. So things like stress, simple things like lack of sleep, loneliness. So social support is critical for our self-regulation. John Cacioppo the late great psychologist and social neuroscientist studied loneliness, and he talked so much about the importance of social support and the impact of social support on our self-regulation. So the third way we could build self-regulation is to reduce the demands on it. So within educational systems and technological systems, can we build support within those programs to reduce one's need for self-regulation? So this was one paper early on that influenced my interest in training self-regulation in particular, so meditation training. This is out of Texas A&M, where they looked at short-term meditation training and improving attention and self-regulation. I did this in the classroom as a graduate student. I introduced a short mindfulness breathing, you can call it meditation. It was just a 3-minute intervention that I did in a classroom. And basically I randomized 2 lecture courses, 2 sections of one lecture to receive either a short meditation training or the other group just got a break. And what I found was that just a simple act of a short mindful breathing exercise done in a group setting. They followed along with a recording. This actually led to greater learning outcomes. So we did quizzes every day for the duration of the study, and this is over 5 quizzes. So you can see that over time, the group that was experiencing the mindfulness breathing exercise were showing better learning outcomes. One piece of feedback from a student, this is an example of what that activity did for them. They said, it calms me down before I start another class, so I'm not entering a learning space stressed or anxious. And another really great thing that I learned from this study was how it impacted the instructors. So this is one example. Susan Churchill said, when you start integrating mindfulness into your pedagogy, there are many things that gently shift in relation to that. It's a different way of being in the classroom and a different way of being with a student. So I do think that bringing in these sorts of practices in the classroom, whether in a physical space or in an online space, there's sort of this breaking down of barriers. We're more open. We do tend to be a little bit more vulnerable, but I think that that's a good thing. So I've also looked at brief mindfulness training in a larger group setting, and in the museum is actually where I've done one study to test the effects of a brief mindful breathing compared to 2 other control conditions. So I tested it against a mind-wandering condition as well as a silent reading condition. So in the mindfulness condition, they essentially just followed along breathing for 5 minutes. And then in the mind-wandering condition, they were instructed to relax their bodies and just daydream. And then the silent reading condition, they were just reading text freely. And what I found was, so I tested their self-reported, how they were feeling in terms of their physiological arousal levels. And so pre-intervention on the left, they're at about the same point, but you can see after the intervention, they were reporting significantly less physiological arousal, which is an indication of somewhat better self-regulation. So we've also tried to implement these sorts of practices online. We recently did a course on edX, a massive open online course called The Science and Practice of Yoga. I was an instructor for this course, and I mention it because It took a lot of time and energy on my part last year. I think we had something like 18,000 enrolled, and the course finished in December. So whenever I get really down on myself, I go to the course forum and read the feedback. So because students, I think for the most part, really benefited from it. In the Link Research Lab at the University of Texas at Arlington, we are in the process of analyzing these data. I don't have any data to report here, but just a quick one comment as an example of a student response to this course. They said, "I'm so glad I achieved my goals for this class. I added so many breathing exercises to my day. I started to notice things differently, and I'm more aware of my body, my mind, and my thoughts." So this is an example of how an online course can be focused on delivering skills that can be used in our daily life. So you can check it out. It's free on edX. So we integrated different mindfulness practices, meditation, and a lot of science behind meditation and science behind yoga. So I'm going to mention a couple ways that I have measured self-regulation. So first off, there are tasks that are designed to do this. So in a couple of my studies, I've done this task that's assessed on an iPad delivered through the National Institute of Health. They have a toolbox of self-regulation tasks. So this is called the dimensional change card sort task, and essentially it involves the ability to match based on a certain cue. So it tells you in the third pane to match on color, so you would match that green bunny to the green boat in the bottom right, and then maybe the next cue would be, okay, match on shape, and instead of matching on color, you would then match on shape. So what this tests is one's ability to have working memory, to hold these things in mind, but also to flexibly shift between different cues. So it's a measure of cognitive control, executive functioning, a huge component of self-regulation. Another way that I've used to measure self-regulation is through the body. So I alluded to that earlier, that we can take assessments and signals from the body to infer states of mind and to infer self-regulation. One particular signal that I focused on is heart rate variability, and there is evidence from other researchers that this physiological signal is an indication of one's ability to self-regulate. In one study, this is data showing that indeed heart rate variability as assessed from the body is predictive of self-regulation, particular of executive functioning skills. So what this essentially shows, if you ignore all the different lines, is a positive correlation between heart rate variability and executive functioning skills. What this particular finding was that this was somewhat moderated by age. So the relationship between heart rate variability and executive functioning was stronger for young children compared to older adults. However, there was a positive relationship across the lifespan. So we've also attempted to assess these physiological states in collaboration with University of South Australia. So I was here last year for a month where we designed a study, and we just finished collecting data in December, so we don't have a lot to present here, although we will collaborate going forward on this data. But the design of the study was we had students come in, and we essentially took physiological assessments from them while they watched an educational video, and we did pre and post testing and we assessed emotions throughout their viewing of the educational video. We found the preliminary results that learning gains was related to more positive emotions throughout the learning process and lower physiological arousal. We also found that emotional stability, as assessed via personality questionnaire, was related to greater heart rate variability. So heart rate variability being some assessment of self-regulation. At Colorado, I have been working with data where we are assessing self-regulation in the form of persistence on an academic task. This is the task here. So students essentially, they're presented with this task on a tablet, and they have the choice to do an academic task, in this case, do math. And at any point, they can choose to play a game or watch a movie. So they have the choice to persist and regulate on an academic task, or they can go and do something that's more fun but and rewarding in the short term, but not as rewarding in the long term. With this task alone, we've shown that how much time students spend on the academic task in proportion to overall time spent in the game is predictive of their academic success and GPA. And that is over and above self-reported measures of grit and self-control. So what we're showing is that these things can be assessed objectively without asking someone directly. That is, those are subject to bias. So we can have students engage in this task, and it is predictive of their academic success. The last thing that I'll really talk about is how we are thinking of building in tools within learning systems to support self-regulation and essentially touch on that third point of reducing the demands on self-regulation in order to help a student build it. So the first step in this study that I've been collecting data for the past 3 months or so on Amazon Mechanical Turk, where we're having students play this learning game. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk the physics playground game. So students are going through playing this game, and we're really just observing them and having them self-report what emotions they're feeling, what regulation strategies they're using in order to design and develop affective supports to put in the game. So a couple points of feedback that we got that is informing what we're thinking about doing as far as building affective supports are things like I closed my eyes and tried to think calmly. In order to change a negative feeling and emotion, I took deep breaths to relax myself. I tried relaxing and deep breathing. So we're getting this qualitative feedback from students of what they're doing so that we can potentially build in these types of supports within the game. So this is just to say that we are in the development of these tasks where when we detect that a student is frustrated and about to quit in the learning game, we can build in these or trigger these interventions to say, hey, take a deep breath and do these within the learning system. Another area of research that I'm focusing on is that the specific effects of breathing on self-regulation. So I'm doing, I just received a small grant to study the effects of a long-term 6-week intervention to study the effects of deep breathing on self-regulation, cognitive performance, and problem solving under stress. So thank you for your attention, and you can contact me here.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions for Catherine.
Catherine, just on the last few slides there where you said the intervention being where close your eyes, think of a happy space and keep breathing. Does it work? Do they actually persist longer? Are they regulating? Have you followed up to see whether or not the interventions you're promoting are actually having an effect?
So not in the particular learning game. So at this stage, we're just developing the affective support, and then the big NSF grant is to see whether these affective supports are effective in keeping children to persisting, and are they learning as a result of putting these affective supports within the game, above and beyond traditional supports like encouragement and praise and that sort of thing.
Thanks, Catherine. Just interested, you said that self-regulation was an indicator of economic success or wealth by the age of 32. I was wondering if this was tested across different socioeconomic groups, given the wide disparity in the US.
Mm-hmm. So the data from that was out of New Zealand, and it followed the individuals across the lifespan, and it was a gradient. So it essentially looked at across all socioeconomic status, and it followed 1,000 individuals born in the same year in the same district. So you assume that it is representative of an entire group of people.
So based on studies to date, especially the New Zealand one, how much of it is nature versus nurture, in the sense of whether any intervention strategies to try and improve people with low self-regulatory skills in that study group at any point? I mean, is it pretty much, if you're born with good skills, you're going to go on and be successful? Or, I mean, this is obviously what you're trying to test here, but is there any evidence that intervention creates a great sort of longer-term effect?
So in that particular study, there were no interventions. That's one sort of limitation of the intervention work thus far, is we aren't really studying how these early interventions are affecting people, later on. We've just been able to follow them longitudinally, so we've assessed them in children, and then we've seen naturally how they progress. But as far as long-term follow-ups of interventions, I'm not familiar with any really good data on it. I will say that it's both. So like any skill that we have, or any trait, it's contributed from both our genetics and our environment, and it's in combination that those two work together to influence our behavior. As far as heritability of self-regulation, those estimates range from about 0.2 to 0.5, but I think the great thing about self-regulation in particular, and why I'm so interested in it, is it is particularly malleable. So we know that we can change it, and we can grow it, and in particular in young children.
We are working with more mature age learners in our project UniSA Online. Is there any research available that this sort of self-regulation training, but just even the basics of mindfulness, meditation, or breathing exercises could help the affective dimensions of adult learners? Because, of course, one of the things with studying online and studying purely online is that golden chalice of motivation and keeping learners engaged online over the long term. And while that has many factors, it sounds like self-regulation has some promise in terms of helping people deal with the stress of learning in a new environment, especially in their first year.
So there are a number of studies in the broader mindfulness literature of its positive effects on building positive emotions and increasing self-regulation. I think that there's a gap in the learning space in terms of adult learners. That's, as you can see, there's much more research devoted to building these skills in children. But we do know that self-regulation is malleable across the lifespan. In terms of particularly online learning, I'm not familiar with specific research that has looked at the positive effects of mindfulness intervention on motivation or affect, but there are plenty of studies that I'd be happy to share with you in the broader space of mindfulness and its positive effects on self-regulation and motivation.
Just a follow-on comment. When you talk about adult learners, you might also come at from the clinical psychology angle. So like teaching people cognitive behavior therapy, which is in some ways skills for like monitoring emotions and responding to them. I think there's really good evidence that kind of thing can help learners a lot. It helps everyone, like reduces depression, reduces dropout from work. So I think that could be a pretty good bet for something to test in online settings in tandem with mindfulness training.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for that talk. So one of the challenges mindfulness is facing is that it's good for everything and everybody loves it. And that's, you know, I feel the skeptic hairs on the back of my neck rising, right? And I'm curious, are there domains or situations in education where you found mindfulness provides not a benefit? And I think about mindfulness often as an emotion regulation and dampening effect. And so this naturally led me to start thinking about places where emotion is an important part of what things, of the interaction itself. Thinking of the arts, for instance, or athletics, right, where emotion is a big player. But I know that some of these actually practice mindfulness as well. So I'm curious from the research and the literature that you've spent time with, if you know of a place where mindfulness has shown either not to be effective or actually dampened people's performance.
Yeah, I'll just say I don't think that mindfulness is like the panacea for everything. However, there are plenty of studies coming out where it's been shown in small experiments where, for example, they've randomized a group to mindfulness versus mind wandering, and they've showed that those in the mindfulness had greater instances of false memories after. So that's one example where they've seen, you know, sort of the opposite effects of what they predicted. In my own experience in doing this, I've touched on this, that not all students want to do it, and it can anger them. They, you know, it should be a choice. They should never be forced to participate in an activity like that. And I think that it can produce some resentment if it were ever forced upon an individual. So in all the studies that I've done, they've had the option not to participate. So in that sense, I think it could be demotivating. So yeah, that's sort of a couple of examples. But yeah, I don't think it's the solution for everything, but I think the simple act of learning to pay attention is a critical skill that we could all use.